Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Chabot seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation expands government and bureaucracy, creating 3 new offices at the Department of Homeland Security, Justice, and the FBI to supposedly monitor and investigate and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. Well, in case the majority isn't aware, the federal government specifically, these agencies already monitors and prosecutes instances of domestic terrorism. They work often in conjunction with each other to prevent instances of domestic terrorism before they occur, to keep the citizens of this country safe, and that's what they ought to be doing. The more concerning issue with this legislation is, as the ranking member mentioned, with the Attorney General's October 4th memorandum, which labeled parents involved in their children's education as domestic terrorists. Now, I'm a former school teacher myself and interacted with the kids and their parents on a regular basis. I taught the 7th and 8th grade in an inner city school. It was a long time ago, admittedly, but I don't think parents have changed all that much. And it's the parents who cared about their kids' education. The kids tended to do better and paid more attention, actually did their homework. The parents were involved. It's the parents that are absent and this is fortunately for the most part the minority of parents who don't pay the attention that they ought to their kids' education, where the kids really suffer. So we ought to encourage parents to be involved in their kids' education as much as possible. And admittedly, school board meetings can be impassioned. They can be highly emotional. They can even sometimes be unruly behavior that occurs there. As we all know, that is certainly possible. And when that happens, yes, the police can be involved in a very small minority of cases when it actually requires law enforcement. But the thing that it riled up an awful lot of parents in this country, for good reason, I think, was the policies which occurred in some communities across the country, for example, where the schools just wouldn't reopen. And yes, we did need to fight COVID, and we need to take it serious, and an awful lot of Americans lost their lives as a result of that. But we know that there were some school boards that went way overboard in keeping those schools closed and the kids out of the best education, which is in the classroom. And we're seeing the results of that now across the country here, where especially those in disadvantaged communities, the kids are having a heck of a time in reading and math and you name it. And the social skills, when you have the youngest kids wearing masks all the time, and that was another thing that happened. Is yes, early on we needed to learn about this and who needed to be masked, but some communities insisted on keeping those kids masked far beyond what common sense would say. So there were a lot of parents, for a lot of reasons, that were riled up. And yes, the teaching of critical race theory, which didn't happen in every school, but it was happening in some schools, and the parents were concerned about that. When you're essentially saying that there's 2 categories of people and telling the kids you're in one or the other, you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, the parents don't like that. They didn't want to have that in their schools, and they had a right to speak out about that. So we know, we all saw this happen, that parents were targeted as domestic terrorism. And the Attorney General was involved with that, with the letter that was sent out, and the last thing we ought to be doing is targeting parents as domestic terrorists. And so this legislation is so unnecessary. And I would argue if, and I condemn white supremacy and terrorism of any sort as much as humanly possible. But this legislation essentially ignores threats from the left. Groups like Antifa, these anarchist groups who actually took over portions of cities only a couple of summers back. And the chairman said that Antifa was a myth. They're not a myth. They're out there doing all kinds of harm to this country, and this particular legislation doesn't consider them at all. So this legislation is unnecessary. And if you want to bring in all these terrorist groups on the left and the right, and you want to do something about them, I think our side would be willing to listen. But this is political legislation that never should come before this Procedures Committee. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.